Hello, and we are back with the second part of your online module about research. So we're going to pick up where we left off and begin looking at experiments. So I'm going to, again, put myself up in the corner so that we can begin. So experiments. When I saw this meme, I just had to add it. If you haven't seen Napoleon Dynamite, I just felt this was perfect. But yeah, we're going to be learning about things like independent and dependent variables, random assignment. Again, not in as much detail as you've covered in previous classes, perhaps more of a review. So, experiments. This is the first time that we see the word control. It is a controlled study. And the first time we see the word manipulate. That does manipulate one variable to see how it affects another variable. So the big difference here is pretty obvious. The fact that yes, the experimenter does get to control the situation while also looking at more than one variable and seeing how one affects the other. So this is the first time that you do get to use that phrase, cause and effect. As we saw with correlational studies, we can't say that. We can only say that they have a relationship. But here we can say the actual statement. Writing your own notes helps you to get better test scores, or causes you to get better test scores. So, as I mentioned previously, in this class we used to have students do research projects, and here's one. So the student was trying to look at whether or not a reinforcer would improve students' memories. So they gave the students different memory tasks. One group of the students would get reinforcement for when they did well. The other group did not. And then they compared the results over time to see if that reinforcement had an impact or an effect on the short-term memory. All right, so here's one of these videos. It's good because it makes the point, but you're going to see the quality of the animation is quite poor, but it's almost funny. But again, it does make a good point, showing a nice, simple experiment.
Does marijuana impair memory? Psychologists have designed experiments to help answer this question. Different amounts of THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, are added to food eaten by participants. Some people may not receive any THC. They are then asked to learn lists of words. A week or so later, they are asked to remember the words. People who receive certain doses of THC usually remember less words than those who receive smaller doses or no THC.
So, simple study, and it's real easy to see what their two variables are. They're looking at THC, they're looking how it affects memory, and you can see the control because one group received a treatment that the other did not. All right, so one of our first key terms with experiments is the independent variable. This is also abbreviated as IV, and this is the thing that is being controlled by the experimenters. Often the way I find the independent variable is asking myself, what is the difference between the two groups? Because usually one group is getting some sort of treatment that the other either isn't getting at all or is getting less of. So, what was the independent variable in this study we looked at? What did one group get that the other didn't? If you're thinking extrinsic reinforcement, you're correct. So they rewarded one group to see how it might impact memory, compared it to the group that did not get the reward. What about this one? If you said marijuana or THC, ding, 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 you were right. So our second term, dependent variable, abbreviated DV. This is looking at the resulting behavior. So after you have your two groups, they get two different treatments. What are you measuring afterwards? So this is where you're trying to see, does my independent variable have an impact on my dependent variable? I always I learned this little trick in graduate school, and they said if you write down this phrase, the effects of blank on blank, Any study, you can fill in those blanks. And when you fill in those blanks, you know which one is the independent variable and which one is the dependent variable. So the marijuana study, is it the effects of memory on marijuana? Or is it the effects of marijuana on memory? Ding, that tells you which is your independent variable. Your independent variable comes first, and then you see how it affects the dependent variable. So let's shout it out so even those in the back can hear us. The dependent variable is caused by that independent variable. Okay, so the THC affected the memory. The reinforcement affected the memory, and so on. All right, so I thought if you're a visual learner, this might also be helpful for seeing how the experiment is done. So you have a sample. You randomly assign them to one of two groups, and they get some sort of treatment, some sort of exposure, and then you measure how that impacts a common dependent variable. Let's look at a couple of practice questions because, well, although Dwight might disagree with me, I do see his point that practice does make better, but it might also make perfect. So, Dr. Maynard is studying the effects of sleep deprivation on attention span. His experimental group sleeps 2 hours a night. The control group sleeps 8 hours. Then he measures their ability to stay awake in class. What is the independent variable? What do you think? If amount of sleep came to mind, you are correct. That is the difference between the two groups. One only slept 2 hours, one slept 8 hours. You can also fill in the blanks, the role of sleep deprivation on attention span. Sleep deprivation came first. All right, Miss Elliott is performing an experiment with her 6th grade class. She randomly lets half the students sit on bouncy balls, like that, rather than a regular chair to see if it reduces their fidgeting or their off-task behavior. What's her dependent variable? If you thought C, amount of off-task behavior, you're also correct. Good job. Because that was the final thing that she was measuring. What is the effect of the bouncy ball on off-task behavior? All right, let's continue with experiments. So I mentioned this idea of random assignment in that visual, but I do want to make sure you get that in your notes. To have an experiment, you must have random assignment to those groups. So whether you're looking at who gets THC and who doesn't, who gets reinforcement and who doesn't, or who gets to sit on the bouncy ball and who doesn't, you have to randomly assign them. Now, experimenters typically use something we call a random number chart, but there are a variety of ways you can do true random assignment. The reason that this is important is you want to make sure that the only real difference between your two groups is that independent variable and not some other factor. So for instance, on the THC study, if I were to go with volunteers and say, okay, who wants to be in the marijuana group, who wants to be in the non-marijuana group? There's probably already a difference between those two groups of people. Maybe those who are already using marijuana and those who aren't. So my effect, looking at how it impacts short-term memory, is being confounded by the fact that I haven't controlled for everything. But if I randomly assign you to THC or no THC, then I can assume that if there is a difference between those groups, that perhaps that is the reason why, because if you're randomly assigned, the only real difference between you all should be whether or not you received my independent variable. So here's a quick video trying to make that point.
By randomly assigning groups, the different groups, on average, will be similar to each other. They will have about the same number of men and women, young and old, and all different characteristics. With random assignment, we can say that the two groups were equivalent at the start of the study. That way, any changes at the end of the study are most likely due to our independent variable, caffeine. Random assignment helps to eliminate bias. There was a good reason why we didn't want to use the other types of groups, such as male and female, or the first half of the participants who showed up got caffeine and the second half didn't get caffeine, there's something innately different between those two groups. And by using random assignment, we don't have to worry about that.
So hopefully that makes sense
By randomly assigning
as to why random assignment is important. So we got Grumpy Cat here also trying to make the point that you really can't compare if you don't have some sort of a control group that isn't getting that independent variable. All right, so where she was talking about the problem with using a volunteer method when it comes to creating your groups. I remember when I was in graduate school seeing a lot of research studies, and they would ask for volunteers and say, volunteer if you want to be in the waking up early group. Well, if the study is trying to look at the difference between waking up early or sleeping in and perhaps how it impacts, let's say, attention span, and if I say, I need volunteers who are willing to wake up at 6 a.m. for the next 2 weeks, the rest of you need to sleep until 9. There's an inherent difference between people who are going to volunteer to wake up at 6 a.m. and those who want to sleep till 9. So I've already messed up my study. All right, so additionally, another term, quasi-experiments. There are a lot of studies out there that are really just quasi-experiments because they did not include random assignment. Well, the reason that we still use quasi-experiments is when you're studying human beings, there are a lot of things that we simply cannot control. So, before I get into the video, let me explain what I mean. I cannot force you to smoke cigarettes in order to see the impact on your lungs. I cannot force you to put your child in daycare for 40 hours a week to see the impact on that child's social skills. So for things like that, where we can't really force a person to change their life that dramatically, especially in a way that might be harmful to them, we have to do a quasi-experiment.
A quasi-experiment is designed a lot like a true experiment, except that in the quasi-experimental design, the participants are not randomly assigned to experimental groups. In a true experiment, research participants have an equal chance of being assigned to any condition of the independent variable, the one being manipulated by the researcher, that is involved in the study. So, for instance, if a researcher was examining the effects of caffeine on reading comprehension, she might randomly assign participants to one of 3 independent variable conditions: those who drink 1 cup of soda, 2 cups of soda, or no soda. She might then assess each person's reading comprehension abilities following exposure to the independent variable. In a true experiment, each participant who volunteered would have an equal chance of being assigned to any of the 3 groups. Quasi-experiments are employed when the researcher is interested in independent variables that cannot be randomly assigned. Usually this happens when the independent variable in question is something that is an innate characteristic of the participants involved. Let's look at a couple of examples to help illustrate the point. Here are 2 examples of simple quasi-experimental designs that will help you see the difference between a true experiment and a quasi-experiment. Dr. Jones is a personality expert who studies the impact that personality traits have on intelligence. For the purposes of her current research project, she is interested in examining the IQ scores of people who score highly in each of the 5 Big 5 personality factors. Each of the 5 personality factors are a quasi-independent variable. Personality traits are inherent to each person, so random assignment cannot be used. Participants would initially be assigned to groups based on their personality assessment score across each of the 5 personality factors. Now that Dr. Jones has her participant group assignments, she can examine the impact that personality factors may have on intelligence. If a true experimental design were used, each participant would be randomly assigned to each personality group, regardless of whether or not they possess those personality traits, which would not really address the question that Dr. Jones is asking.
So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. So I thought I'd show you this visual. I saw this in a textbook once and I liked it. And this shows you the spectrum of research studies from least invasive to most. So on the one far side, we have a descriptive study Nothing is manipulated. Nothing is controlled. You only study one thing just by observing. Then we have a correlational study. Again, you're not controlling anything. You're just looking at the relationship between two variables. A quasi-experimental study, you do have some control. You are looking at more than one variable, but the thing is you're just not randomly assigning people to groups. And then finally the experimental. Full random assignment, full control of more than one variable. So here are a couple practice questions. Jack wants to examine the influence of music on test anxiety. In one of his existing classes, they play soothing music while the students take a test. In his other class, they don't play music. He compares test scores and finds that students with music scored better. What type of study is that? Well, it looks like an experiment, but it is not. It is actually a descriptive study. I'm going to see if I can get my laser pointer out here, mainly because of this word right here. He used existing classes. He did not randomly assign them to music or no music. So he just took his 4th period and compared it to his 5th period. So that makes it quasi-experimental. Ormrod and Jenkins reported that in a group of 20 3rd and 4th graders, the predominant strategy for learning a list of spelling words was saying each letter of the word out loud. What is that? Well, if you thought descriptive study, you are correct, because it's only one variable. They're not looking at predominant strategy based on grade, based on gender, based on anything else. They're just looking at what's the most common strategy they use to learn their list. La Rosa has reported that parents with higher educational levels are more likely to read to their children than parents with lower educational levels. What would that be? If you're thinking correlational, you are correct, because it is looking at two variables, but they're certainly not assigning people to groups. They're certainly not doing anything other than saying, all right, let's compare parents with high education, those with low education, how much are they reading? There's no independent or dependent variable. All right, so our last segment is going to be looking at research designs that relate to human development. Everything that we've covered so far has probably been review. This you may or may not have covered. So, when you're looking at human development, you're studying how an individual grows and changes over time. This requires a different way of looking at research, because you don't want to just see what are 5th graders like. You want to see how do 5th graders turn into 6th graders, 7th graders, 8th graders, and so on. So, I just thought I'd start with this meme. There's actually a really funny Twitter account out there called Research Wahlberg that has nothing but Mark Wahlberg memes about research. So call me a geek, but I thought that was funny. All right, so what is longitudinal design? This is where you study one group of people and you follow them over time as they age. So you might start when they're 1 year old, follow them when they're 2, follow them when they're 3, and depending on how much funding you have and how much time you have, you follow them over a period of time. Longitudinal studies are great because they do provide you with information on what we call age changes. So, how does that 3-year-old change into a 4-year-old? How do they develop into a 4-year-old? Longitudinal studies are great, but they do take a lot of time, obviously. They take a lot of resources, therefore they're not as common. Because you can see here in this one study, this would take 60 years to do this particular study. So if you don't want to spend 60 years seeing how a 20-year-old compares to a 60-year-old, you can do something called, where's my cursor? A cross-sectional study. Cross-sectional studies, much more common. So here you're comparing different age groups, but at the same time of measurement. So you could study that same group, the 20-year-olds, the 50-year-olds, and the 80-year-olds, but all in the same day. Now, technically, it'd probably be more likely over a period of days or weeks because research does take time, but still way different than waiting 60 years for that to happen. So when we did do those research studies that I've mentioned previously in this class, here was a student who did a cross-sectional study looking at art and comparing art at different age periods. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So a cross-sectional design, as I said, it's more common because it's cheaper, it takes less time, you're comparing different age groups at the same time, which you already have in your notes. But what this gives you is age differences. So I'm not seeing how a 5-year-old grows into a 6-year-old. I'm comparing a 5-year-old to a 6-year-old. That is a different outcome, shall we say. So with a cross-sectional study, what you tend to encounter is you're looking at cohort differences as well. Because there are what we call cohorts, age cohorts have different experiences. So for instance, here we have an older lady compared to a young boy. She's looking up at the clouds and dreaming about, what do you think they're made of? And when he hears cloud, he's thinking about the cloud on his phone because he comes from a different cohort, a time period where the word cloud might bring up a slightly different image for him at first. So again, cohort differences can be something that can muck up your findings a little bit in a cross-sectional study. So for instance, if I were to do a cross-sectional study looking at the use of technology when students are in college, how did technology impact your homework? So this picture up above might represent my current 20-year-olds who are in college. Well, let's say I'm doing a cross-sectional study, and maybe I'm in that study. I'm almost 50, and so if you were to ask me about the technology I used when I was in college, no joke, that's it right there. I lived in a sorority house with 45 girls, and we had one of those word processors in the downstairs living room that all 45 of us shared. And as you can see from the little screen, you could see about one sentence at a time before it would type it up. And we thought it was high tech. So cohort difference. So I wouldn't really see, pardon me, how technology changes over time. If you're talking to a group of current 20-year-olds and current 50-year-olds, we have very different experiences with technology. And here's what the data looks like. So you can see if I am looking at data for a longitudinal study, I use line graphs because I'm showing that same individual when they were 5, when they grew to 20, when they grew to 40, and then 65. Cross-sectional studies, I have to use bars because I'm looking at a different group at each time. So I want to end with this question. How are you going to use this as a teacher? Because you might be thinking, well, I'm not going to be a researcher. I don't plan on publishing research. I plan on being in a classroom. Why do I need to know this? How is this going to help me? I think you're going to find that research is going to be very beneficial to you in the future when you're trying to make instructional decisions. So for instance, you'll see the two pictures below, a boy with a fidget spinner and a class sitting on yoga balls. You'll hear of fads and changes that come up, and you're going to be asking yourself, should I try that? Will that be helpful or not? Well, you can go to the research and see what other teachers have found to help you make an educated decision about things. This is also part of that community of educators where you are using the findings of your peers to grow as an educator. And we all need to continue to grow as educators. Now, okay, so I had to use this from Big Bang Theory, just cracked me up. How you can use this as a teacher, you're also going to understand that Google isn't always the best way of finding answers. That, yeah, you can Google to get to research articles, but when you are typing in to try to find out if fidget spinners are a good thing, you're going to need to put your thinking cap on and try and look at So not only what is the source of the information, but how did they come about their findings? And you're going to find through professional development that there are a lot of journals out there. There are a lot of professional groups that you can join to get solid research to find out what is going on in the field. So for instance, if you're asking yourself this question, why kids shouldn't sit still in class? Well, there's some cool research out there. And even though this comes from the New York Times, when I read the article, you can see the link to the 2013 report from the Institute of Medicine, so you can go to the actual article and read it. But this is how you can use research as a teacher. By going out there and finding what other people have found and say, oh wow, so if I have my students be active, if we get up and do jumping jacks and do kinesthetic activities in math, they're going to have better attention span, they're going to think more quickly, they're going to do better on my tests. Here's another one that I found, and actually there are lots of studies on this. The advantages of writing your notes rather than typing them. That is one of the reasons why I do not give students the PowerPoints, that I do have something where they actually need to fill it in, but I do give you the option to type that. But there's a lot of studies that talk about the power of writing your notes. Now, I wanted to bring this up, a cultural perspective. When it comes to the world of diversity, diversity touches on our research as well. There are a lot of great researchers out there who try to take these issues related to education and study them cross-culturally. To go to different places on the globe and compare things like how students learn and what makes for effective teaching strategies across the globe. So, to finish up, studying research is going to help you make better decisions, and decisions that are informed based upon research practices. And then understanding that research, understanding how research is performed and the types of conclusions you can make, is going to help you be better at interpreting what you're reading. So that's it. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope that you found this informative, even if some of it was a review. But as I've mentioned previously, you'll have a lot of concepts throughout college that you will cover repeatedly to make sure it sinks in, because it's important. So thank you.